I distinctly remember the day of my big oral exam. This was the day that I was defending my dissertation prospectus, and it had been 2 weeks since I had finished my written exams. Now, let me tell you, I still didn't feel like I knew everything that I needed to do well. I still was not feeling confident going into the day of. And even after I got through that exam portion, when I gave my presentation and I was sent to another room so that my dissertation committee could assess my performance, I was not feeling confident. I was afraid that I was going to be that person that wasn't going to pass because there were, in fact, people in my department who didn't pass. And then on top of that, I was also actually pregnant and had not told anyone in my department that I was pregnant because I was afraid that it would negatively impact their perception and thus negatively influence their assessment of my performance. And lo and behold, I walked back into the room to a committee that was smiling and told me that I had passed. And I remember just bawling my eyes out because I couldn't believe that I had passed. Today, I wanted to bring up the topic of how to prepare for oral exams for those of y'all that are going through this process who may also be feeling a little bit nervous or apprehensive. I'm going to share some tips to help you get through this process. Welcome to the top global ranked and award-nominated Grad School Femtoring Podcast, the place for first-gen BIPOCs to listen in on conversations about grad school and growth. In this podcast, you'll learn about all things higher education, personal development, and sustainable productivity. This is Doctora Yvette Martinez-Vu, and I will be serving as your Femtor, providing you with tips and tricks and everything else you need to know to successfully navigate grad school and beyond. For over 14 years, I've been empowering first-gen students of color along their personal and professional journeys, and I'm really excited to support you too. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Grad School Femtoring Podcast. This is your host, Doctora Yvette. Let me start with a brief visual description. Today, I'm wearing a hot pink t-shirt. I've got dark brown straight hair. It's up in a ponytail because that's just what's easier for me right now. I'm wearing some clear glasses. I've got tan over-ear headphones. I'm sitting on a white chair with a purple throw on it. And I've also got my mic on my bottom left-hand side. And that's my visual description. Let me get into the topic of the show. This topic was a topic that was requested, or it wasn't directly requested, but I'm recording it for one of my clients. This is actually one of my longtime clients. I've been with her for over a year now, as she's gone through many transitions in her graduate journey, and she's at this point where she's finished her written exams and is getting ready for the big oral exam. I understand to a biggest extent the way that she's feeling, and I wanted to provide a resource for her. So I thought, let me record it as an episode. I'll probably turn this episode into a blog post to share that with her and then also share it with my audience. So if I get the blog out early, I'll link it in the show notes so you can check out the blog and then check out whichever resource is most useful for you if you are also in the position of starting to prepare for your oral exam. So let's get into these tips because I have a lot of them and I don't want this episode to get too long. I have 15 tips for surviving your PhD oral exam. The first one is probably something that's going to feel very obvious to you, which is to make sure that you are reviewing your prospectus thoroughly. So when I'm talking about oral exams, I'm particularly talking about oral exams in the humanities and social sciences. Typically, when you've got the big oral exam, you are defending your dissertation prospectus or your dissertation proposal, however your department calls it. For the purpose of this episode, I'm going to call it the prospectus. So make sure that you're reviewing that document clearly. If you've received feedback, pay attention to the feedback you're getting. pay attention to the questions that keep coming up in your work. Sometimes those questions come up with the prospectus. Sometimes it comes up when you present your work at national conferences. Sometimes it comes up in discussions in your coursework. So no matter what, start to notice the trends. What are people asking me often, and what is coming up in my prospectus? Also, make sure that you feel comfortable talking about the theoretical framework that you're using. If you're bringing in theory, make sure you're comfortable talking about your methods. I speak as a humanist, and I know that for those of us in the humanities, sometimes we take for granted our methods. So make sure that you have a way to frame and talk about your methods and why they're so important for your work. And also make sure that you start to talk about yourself as a scholar who's making a contribution in the field. This is an important moment for you because when you start a doctoral program, it's easy to fall into the habit of doing a lot of readings and doing a lot of summaries, perhaps writing literature reviews and putting scholars in conversation with one another, but not always necessarily putting yourself in that conversation too. So now you have to start to think about yourself as a colleague and someone who is actually contributing to the field, who does have something to say. What is it that you're saying that is different, that is similar? Put yourself in conversation with the folks that you are studying and reading and were part of your reading list and that you cited in your prospectus. The second tip is to, going along with thinking about the questions that you've been getting, to start to anticipate questions. So think about what are the potential critiques of your work? And sometimes the critiques have to do with things that fall outside of the scope of your work. And if you know they fall outside of the scope of your work, be prepared to say that. Sometimes critiques come up and it's related to maybe time restrictions related to your work. Like if you had more time to do more research, to do more field work, whatever that time restriction is, be aware of that. Be aware that you might be critiqued for that. So definitely consider the potential critiques of your work. Make sure that you prepare responses to these common questions or questions you anticipate, even if the response, like I said, is this falls outside of the scope of my work, or if I had more time, I would do X, Y, and Z. Or sometimes it's the next project. Sometimes the critique is something that you're like, actually, I'm aware of that, and I'm planning to do that for my next project or for my book project or whatever the next thing is that comes after the dissertation. Tip number 3 is to connect to the broader discourse in your field, in your area, in your discipline. So again, make sure you can situate yourself and your work with current debates. How is your research adding to debates, filling in gaps? How is it challenging maybe current debates? So make sure that you feel comfortable in sharing what you have to say and why your work is important and why it's necessary to the field. I know this can be hard to do because sometimes it feels like you're working on a project and everybody's done and said what you're trying to do and say, but not everybody is you and not everybody has your way of thinking, your positionality. And even though you might feel like you don't know enough, trust me, you do have a specific contribution to give to the field. Tip number 4 is to get more comfortable with articulating complex ideas. In graduate school, you might become accustomed to reading a lot of dense work, and sometimes it can feel, for those of us who are first gen and for those of us who maybe speak in more plain terms, it can feel like, oh, how can I even begin to have a conversation in the field if I don't write in that way, or if I'm not writing this dense critical theory, or if I haven't published my work. But trust me, you can understand these ideas. There are different tools and strategies for you to start to become more familiar with the work, no matter how dense and heavy it is. and you can begin to rehearse explaining your work and know you do not have to sound in a particular way to pass. I know I hear this all the time of like, I wish that I could sound more academic, or I feel like my work isn't formal enough. And trust me, it is. And we need more accessible research anyway. So just rehearse explaining your work, but rehearse it with different people. Rehearse it with folks who understand your field and discipline, with subject specialists, and then rehearse your work with the folks who are outside of your discipline, with non-specialists or generalists, or even, I say you can rehearse it with someone like me. With my clients, for the most part, actually, with the exception of this client who we have a lot of shared research interests, which is interesting because I rarely get that. But for the most part, people that work with me are doing work that's very, very different from the work that I did in graduate school. And if they start to publicly practice talking about their work in front of me, I can then give them a generalist perspective of actually what did you mean when you said this, or how does it relate to this other thing that you said earlier? So practice with different types of audiences. That way you can get a sense of how your committee members will react, because you might have committee members that are subject specialists, and maybe you have one person who is outside of your department who might come in with a different perspective. That's why it's good to talk to different people about your work. And also make sure that when you are talking about the work of other scholars, that you have already prepared concise summaries of their work, because this is something that comes up a lot with my clients, is they get really caught up in the details of certain works, certain books, certain articles, and they write really, really long summaries. And in doing so, sometimes it can be hard to synthesize in a couple of sentences. Just tell us what the main gist of it is. What matters most about this? Make sure you have these concise summaries, because that's going to help you so that when you practice, you can continue to remain concise. One of the things that I give as a recommendation, broadly speaking, for folks who are doing interviews or public speaking, is to get accustomed to responding with roughly 3-minute answers. And I say this because if you give too brief of an answer, then it makes it seem like you're not interested or you're not knowledgeable enough. If you give too long of an answer, then you can lose sight of what the main point is of what you're trying to say. So if you learn to start to speak in concise ways, but still long enough that you can make an argument, long enough that you show your interest, long enough that you show that you understand what you're talking about, that's going to help you during this oral exam process and just in general in any interview process. Another thing to do, and some of these things I did, I know that I definitely reviewed my prospectus. I definitely started to think about questions. I definitely practiced talking to my peers, especially folks in my cohort, and even some people outside of my discipline. And this is tip number 5. I did review my written exams. I needed to see what was the feedback that I got on my written exams, what came up, what changes do I need to make, and then be prepared to defend what I said in my written exams, and also be prepared to justify what I was and wasn't going to change based off their feedback. So reviewing the written exams is a must. So that way you know what to say and also potentially what's going to come up for them. Because a lot of times what they say for your written exams and even for your prospectus is also what they'll say during your oral exam. Tip 6 is to stay current. So sometimes when you get these long reading lists, a majority of them might be foundational works, and in them being these canonical works, they might have been published when you were born. Maybe this work from the 80s or from the 90s. And since then, there's been a lot more work that's come out. So make sure that if you have these long lists, that you are at least familiar with some of the recent work, because those are the folks that realistically you might actually meet at conferences. You might actually be in real conversations with. Tip 7 is if you are in an interdisciplinary field, then expect interdisciplinary questions. So I'm thinking here, I was in a performance studies program. It was interdisciplinary. We had folks with backgrounds in literature, backgrounds in history, backgrounds in anthropology, backgrounds in sociology. So we had all kinds of stuff coming into the work. And because of that, depending on the topic, we had to have an understanding of how our work intersected with other disciplines. So just be mindful of that. And this is especially important if you've got, like I said, a committee member that is in another discipline or in another department. Familiarize yourself with the type of questions that you think are going to come from someone in that department who's in a different department than your own. Tip number 8 is to articulate your positionality. Now, this might be less common in STEM fields, but when it comes to the humanities and social sciences, I do think it's important to articulate your positionality as a researcher. You might or might not be encouraged to do it directly in your writing, but you will definitely have to do it anytime you're presenting, anytime you're talking about your work. So you want to know, like, why are you the one doing this work? Especially if you're studying other populations, it's really important to understand your positionality, power dynamics, etc. Tip number 9, this reminds me of what I said earlier about what potential critiques you might get, but this tip is to understand the future implications of your work. So when folks talk to you and they're wondering, like, why should we care about this work? Can you articulate a real world application to your work? It's not always the case. I know many people who are in fields like philosophy where their work might not have direct real world applications, but if it does, then make sure you can articulate that. And even if it doesn't have real world applications, you always want to have the answer to the so what question. Why should other people care? Okay, so now when it comes to less the research portion and more of the taking care of yourself side of the tips, I definitely have to tell you for tip 10 to find ways to manage your stress. This can feel so all-encompassing and so consuming that you might feel guilty to take time for yourself. You might feel guilty anytime you're not preparing for your exams. And it is important for you to rest. It is important for you to do things that restore you. It is important for you to remember, if it helps with your stress management. I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. It is in your committee's best interest to pass you. Please remember this when you're feeling really stressed and really down. No matter what, it is in their best interest. They don't want to have to reschedule and do this all over again. They don't want to have to fail you, because why? It's going to hurt their numbers. It's going to hurt, they could potentially hurt their retention rates. So trust that if you do enough, there's a good chance that you're going to pass, and that anytime you're taking time away to tend to yourself, it's also helping you. Tip number 11 is for those of y'all that use visual aids. Now, I didn't use visual aids, but if you are going to use visual aids, please use them wisely. So don't just bring in visual aids that don't make sense or where you're not justifying why you're using specific images. Make sure that they're there to help, not to hurt or distract your work. Don't rely too much on slides. Be prepared to present and talk about your work even without them, especially because you never know. Sometimes tech mishaps happen. This is how I am. Even though I usually always have slides when I give presentations, I always print them out and have them with me so that if anything happens and I lose my train of thought, I am prepared and I know what I'm going to say because I have my slides or I have my notes or I have my outline, whatever that aid is that's going to help me. I have it available and I make sure I don't rely too much on tech or rely too much on my visual aids. Tip number 12 is for the moment of, make sure that you listen carefully, listen actively, listen deeply. This is hard because you might be in your head, especially those of us that are in our head all the time anyway, especially those of us that may have certain types of neurodivergence that make it hard for us to tune out those thoughts that are in our head. But just for the day of, pay attention to what they're asking you. Not what you think they're going to ask you, not what you think is going to come up after this question, but what is happening in the moment. And if you get really, really caught up in your head, please know that it's okay to ask them to repeat themselves. It's also okay to ask them to reword their question. It's also okay to take a couple of seconds and drink your water. I have done that in the past when I've needed just a little bit of a couple second break just to think, is I've given myself that time, that pause, had a sip of water. That pause is not going to cause you to fail your exam. So you're allowed to ask them to clarify, ask them to reword things, and even to ask for a couple of seconds for you to drink some water. And even ask for a couple of seconds for you to think through your answer. That is also okay. Tip number 13. This is a hard one. Please do your best to be open to feedback and remind yourself that this feedback is not personal. It's not a personal attack on you. It doesn't mean that they are rejecting you. It just means they want your work to be as best as possible. And I get that there are exceptions. I get that there are some people out there who are professors who are out to get you, who are spiteful, who are there to grill you. And I really, really hope that you don't have that type of person on your committee. If you do, then I would just say to take what they say with a grain of salt, and with a big, big grain of salt, knowing their history. And even if they ask you things and you feel like maybe you didn't do 100% a great job, the fact that you got through it is something for you to applaud yourself for. But anyway, going back to being open to feedback, assuming that no one in your committee is there to grill you, is there to be spiteful, then remember that their suggestions are just opportunities for you to keep strengthening your work and that it's not personal. Tip number 14 is to keep going back to your written exams. So not only go back to your prospectus, but to go back and draw connections between your exams and between your prospectus and between some of the things that keep coming up for you when you've presented your work. So start to think about trends in your work and have something to say about those trends. Okay, the last tip is to give yourself an opportunity to practice with your peers. This can be folks in your department. This can be folks in other departments, but who are familiar with your department. See if they're willing to do a mock oral defense with you. See if they're willing to even practice with you. Maybe it's not a full-on mock defense that you schedule, but maybe it's just a couple minutes of their time for you to have a conversation about your work. Have them practice asking you the hard questions, especially the questions you think you might get that make you really nervous. So that way you can just have that practice and it becomes almost second nature for you to answer that really scary question. And yeah, with enough practice, with all these 15 things, please, if you use them as a checkbox, take the transcript, turn it into a checklist. You go through all these things, trust that it will be enough. Please, please do, because just like you've gone through every other milestone in your graduate program, you're going to get through this milestone too. I hope that these tips were helpful, especially to that one person that knows I recorded this for you, but this is also to everybody else out there who's going through this big hurdle. I hope that you're kind to yourself during this process and trust that you will make it through. That's it for this episode. And like always, I'll talk to you all next time. Bye. Thanks so much for joining me in the Grad School Femtoring Podcast. If you like what you heard, here are 4 ways you can support the show. The first is to make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. If you email me a screenshot, I'll send you a surprise freebie. The second way is to get your copy of my free Grad School Femtoring Resource Kit, which includes essential information to prepare for and navigate grad school. You can access it at the link in today's show notes. The third way to support my show is to follow me on social media. You can find me on Instagram with the handle @GradSchoolFemtoring and on LinkedIn by searching my name. The last way to show your love is to order a copy of Is Grad School for Me, my graduate school admissions book for first-gen BIPOCs. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.